A hush, thick and sudden, fell over the ballroom. The lilting melody of the string quartet faltered, then died, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. All eyes, moments before darting between glittering jewels and whispered gossip, now swiveled towards the grand entrance. Lady Alara Vance, momentarily lost in the swirling patterns of the polished marble floor, felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. The air, already warm from the crush of bodies and the glow of 1,000 candles, seemed to grow heavy, expectant. Then he appeared, Duke Alaric of Blackwood. His name, often spoken in hushed tones or with a nervous tremor, seemed to precede him like a chill wind. He was not a man one easily forgot, nor one who faded into the background. His presence was a physical force, pressing down on the festive atmosphere, stripping it bare of its carefree veneer. He stood framed in the archway, a silhouette against the lesser light of the hall, before stepping fully into the ballroom. He was a formidable figure, taller than most, with broad shoulders that strained the impeccable tailoring of his dark velvet coat. His hair, the color of midnight, was swept back from a high forehead, revealing a strong, aquiline nose and a jawline that spoke of unyielding will. But it was his eyes that truly commanded attention. A startling shade of glacial blue, they swept across the assembled aristocracy, missing nothing, acknowledging no one. A shiver, not entirely unpleasant, ran through Alara. He moved with a predator's grace, each step deliberate, resonating with an unspoken authority that made even the most boisterous lord straighten his posture. Lady Agatha, ever observant, leaned closer to Alara, her voice a low murmur. "The Duke's reputation precedes him, dear. They say he once silenced a riot with merely a look." She offered a tight, knowing smile, her gaze fixed on the approaching Duke. A man to be respected and feared in equal measure. Alara merely nodded, her own attention still fixed on the Duke. There was a raw power about him, an untamed quality that belied the refined setting. He was a wolf among sheep, and the sheep, for all their finery, knew it. As he drew nearer, a path seemed to clear before him, the dancers parting like reeds in a current. Whispers, like the rustle of silk, started to ripple through the crowd, nervous and awed. He was almost upon them, his gaze still sweeping the room, when Alara, lost in her contemplation of the man, took a step back, her heel catching on the hem of her gown. Her hand, holding a goblet of crimson wine, jerked. Time seemed to slow. The rich, dark liquid arced through the air, a fleeting ruby arc, before splattering directly onto the Duke's pristine white cravat and the lapel of his dark coat. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, cut through the already strained silence. It was a sound that seemed to suck all the air from the room, leaving a vacuum. Alara's own breath hitched in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The goblet, now empty, felt suddenly heavy in her trembling hand. Duke Alaric stopped. His head, which had been turned slightly to the left, slowly rotated until his glacial blue eyes, now narrowed to dangerous slits, fixed solely on Alara. The silence deepened, becoming absolute, suffocating. Every single person in the ballroom seemed to hold their breath, their gazes flitting between the crimson stain on the Duke's immaculate attire and the mortified young woman who had caused it. Lady Agatha's eyes widened, a rare expression of genuine shock on her usually impassive face. She made a small, choked sound, as if she herself had been struck. The air crackled with tension, thick and palpable. No one dared move, no one dared speak. The Duke, a statue carved from granite, stood perfectly still, the crimson stain a stark, vibrant counterpoint to his severe elegance. His gaze, colder than any winter's night, bore into Elara. In that instant, she felt utterly exposed, utterly alone, and yet, a spark of her inherent defiance, however small, began to flicker within her. She met his gaze, her chin rising almost imperceptibly, even as the heat of shame flooded her cheeks. The fate of her entire season, perhaps her entire future, hung suspended in the heavy, silent air. A challenge on the chessboard. The ballroom's hush was a tangible weight pressing down on Elara, threatening to steal her breath. Her heart thrummed against her ribs, a frantic captive. Her gaze remained fixed on the crimson stain unfurling across the Duke's immaculate white jabot, a stark, vivid testament to her calamitous misstep. A potent current crackled through the air, a blend of aristocratic censure and Alaric's unreadable, raw power. She steeled herself for the inevitable scathing rebuke, the public shaming. Then, a low chuckle, so unexpected it sent a tremor down Elara's spine, rumbled from the Duke's chest. It held no amusement, rather a deeper, darkly predatory quality. He tilted his head, his dark eyes, moments ago a chilling void, now glinting with a flicker of intrigue. A rather spirited greeting, Lady Elara, Alaric finally drawled, his voice a silken rasp that sliced through the tension without easing it. He produced a handkerchief from his sleeve, dabbing ineffectually at the wine. Perhaps, he continued, his gaze locking with hers, you would prefer a more cerebral challenge. A game of chess, Lady Elara. The proposition hung in the air, ludicrous and bizarre. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Chess? With the Duke? The man renowned for his ruthless business acumen and strategic genius on the battlefield? And with her? Whispers erupted, swiftly silenced by a sharp glance from Alaric, but the damage was done. Tongues would wag for weeks, dissecting the Duke's motives, Elara's audacity, and the sheer impropriety. Elara felt a prickle of unease, yet beneath it, defiance sparked. She knew chess. Her father, more comfortable with ancient texts than societal graces, had taught her young, often lamenting her unladylike obsession with strategy. She met the Duke's gaze, her chin lifting imperceptibly. I accept, Your Grace. A wave of murmurs followed them to a secluded alcove where a polished mahogany chessboard sat, pieces gleaming beneath the chandelier's light. Alaric, with a fluid grace that belied his imposing stature, took the black pieces. Elara, her hand steady despite the knot in her stomach, chose white. The initial moves were a delicate dance of veiled aggression. Elara, to his evident surprise, opened with a queen's gambit, a bold, calculated risk. Alaric's dark brows rose fractionally, a silent acknowledgement of her unconventional approach. The alcove's atmosphere, though hushed, throbbed with anticipation. Servants, ostensibly tidying decor, lingered within earshot, their faces carefully blank. Elara advanced her knight, a swift, decisive motion threatening his pawn. Alaric countered with a rook, a defensive maneuver that simultaneously opened a diagonal. Each move was a silent dialogue, a probing of wills. She found herself utterly absorbed, the ballroom's external pressures fading as the intricate possibilities of the board consumed her. She observed Alaric's strategy unfolding, a slow, methodical constriction designed to ensnare her king. It was a classic Alaric move, she realized, mirroring the ruthless efficiency rumored in all his dealings. But Elara was no passive opponent. She spotted an opening, a vulnerability, in his meticulously constructed defense. With a deep breath, she sacrificed a bishop, a move that drew another subtle flicker of surprise across Alaric's impassive face. It was a calculated risk, leaving her momentarily exposed, but forging a devastating counterattack. The Duke paused, his long fingers hovering over a pawn, his eyes narrowed in thought. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft rustle of silk as a nearby lady shifted. Then Alaric moved, not to counter her immediate threat, but to advance his queen. A bold, almost arrogant push that seemed to disregard her recent maneuver. Elara's breath caught. He was testing her, gauging if she would be intimidated, if she would falter. A faint smile touched her lips. She moved her knight, forcing Alaric's queen into a corner, completely disrupting his planned assault. It was a move born of instinct and a sudden, fierce confidence. Alaric's hand froze mid-air, his gaze fixed on the board. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his eyes to meet hers. For the first time, Elara saw a genuine, albeit fleeting, expression of surprise on the Duke's face. He hadn't expected her to push back. He hadn't expected her to win. Defiance in society's gaze. The clinking of crystal and the murmur of polite conversation always grated on Elara, but tonight it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. After the chess match, which Alaric had surprisingly kept private, she'd assumed a return to the usual stilted dances and meaningless banter. She was wrong. As the Duke held court in the Grand Salon, discussing the impending trade negotiations with the Eastern Kingdoms, Elara found herself listening with a new, almost aggressive attentiveness. He spoke of strategic concessions and economic leverage, his voice a low, resonant hum that usually commanded unquestioning assent. "Surely, Your Grace," Elara interjected, her voice cutting through the well-rehearsed cadences of his argument. "Such a concession on grain imports would cripple our own agricultural sector. The smaller farmers, those without the vast estates, would face ruin." A sudden jarring silence fell over the assembled nobility. Eyes, accustomed to differential nods and murmured agreements, widened in disbelief. Lady Agatha, standing a discreet distance away, paled visibly, her hand rising instinctively to her throat. Alaric, however, merely turned his head slowly. His gaze, usually so impenetrable, now held a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of something Elara couldn't quite decipher. Amusement? Challenge? Lady Elara makes a valid point. Alaric finally conceded, his words measured, if one were to view the matter through such a narrow lens. However, the long-term benefits of opening new markets for our textiles far outweigh the temporary inconvenience to a few agrarian concerns. Temporary inconvenience? Elara countered, a surprising heat rising within her. For many, Your Grace, it would be a lifetime struggle. Perhaps a direct consultation with those most affected, rather than relying solely on the reports of your advisors, would offer a more comprehensive understanding. Gasps rippled through the room. A few dowagers fanned themselves with renewed vigor. This wasn't merely impudence, it was a direct affront to the Duke's authority, a challenge to his very method of governance. Society watched, breathless, for the inevitable crushing retort, the public humiliation, but it never came. Instead, Alaric gave a slow, deliberate nod. "An interesting proposition, Lady Elara. One I shall certainly consider." His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than strictly necessary. A silent communication passing between them that left Elara both mortified and inexplicably invigorated. The following day, a sealed missive arrived for Elara. It wasn't an invitation to another social gathering, nor a reprimand. The Duke, it read, required her presence at the weekly council meeting regarding the upkeep of the northern garrisons. A meeting traditionally attended solely by military strategists and seasoned administrators. Elara stared at the parchment, a prickle of unease warring with a burgeoning sense of defiance. This was a test, she knew. A deliberate placement into a masculine domain, a silent dare for her to falter. Later that week, another request arrived, this time concerning the logistics of a new trade route through the treacherous Grey Peaks, a task usually relegated to the most experienced cartographers and explorers. Society buzzed with scandalized whispers. What is the Duke thinking? Has he lost his mind? Lady Elara, at a garrison meeting? It's preposterous. Yet, Elara attended each meeting, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She listened, she learned, and occasionally she asked a pointed question that made the stern-faced men around her shift uncomfortably in their seats. Each time, she felt Alaric's gaze upon her, a silent, scrutinizing pressure. He wasn't merely observing, he was gauging her resolve, measuring her spirit against the weight of expectation and ridicule. And with each unconventional task, with each societal sneer, Elara felt a strange, thrilling sense of purpose solidify within her. She was no longer just defying him, she was defying them all. The hunt and a heated exchange. The parchment on Elara's desk was a dizzying array of numbers and trade routes, a task Alaric had set with a smirk, no doubt expecting her to falter. Yet, fueled by a stubborn refusal to be dismissed, Elara had spent the better part of 2 nights hunched over the maps and ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration. She not only deciphered the convoluted tariffs and shipping manifests, but identified several inefficiencies and proposed a bold yet logical restructuring that promised to increase revenue by a significant margin. When she presented her findings, Alaric's usual impassive expression had flickered with something akin to surprise, quickly masked by a curt nod. He offered no praise, but the immediate implementation of her suggestions spoke volumes. Similar tests followed, complex logistical problems, analyses of geopolitical tensions, even a detailed report on the dwindling timber reserves in the northern forests. Each time, Elara met the challenge, not merely completing the tasks, but offering perspectives that often forced Alaric to reconsider his own long-held strategies. The library, once a place of quiet solitude, now hummed with the quiet tension of their intellectual sparring. Weeks later, a crisp autumn morning found Elara mounted on a spirited chestnut mare, her riding habit a practical deep green, a stark contrast to the shimmering silks of the court. The Duke's hunt was a spectacle of hounds baying, horses thundering, and the distant calls of horn blowers. Elara, though proficient in the saddle, found little joy in the chase. Her gaze often strayed from the fleeing deer to the sun-dappled glades, appreciating the quiet majesty of the forest. Suddenly, a yelp of pain pierced the air. A young stable boy, no older than 12, had stumbled, dropping a valuable hunting falcon's lure in the mud. The falconer, a man known for his quick temper, raised a hand to strike the boy. But before he could land the blow, Alaric's voice, sharp as a winter wind, cut through the clamor. "Are you blind, boy? That lure costs more than your family earns in a year," he roared, his eyes like chips of flint. He dismounted, striding towards the trembling boy, who cowered, mud clinging to his threadbare clothes. Alaric's boot nudged the lure. Pick it up, and if you ever show such carelessness again, you'll find yourself cleaning the latrines with your tongue. A collective gasp went through the hunting party, but Alara felt a prickle of unease that quickly escalated into a burning indignation. She spurred her mare forward, dismounting with an abruptness that startled her groom. "Duke Alaric, that is uncalled for," she declared, her voice ringing clear in the sudden silence. Alaric turned, his gaze narrowing. "Lady Alara, this is hardly your concern." "It is my concern when I see a child threatened for an honest mistake," she retorted, stepping between Alaric and the boy, whose eyes widened in fear and a flicker of hope. "He is a boy, not a hardened criminal. A moment of clumsiness does not warrant such cruelty." "Cruelty?" Alaric scoffed, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "He needs to learn discipline. Such carelessness reflects poorly on my household." "Discipline is taught with guidance, not fear." Alara's voice rose, her hands clenching at her sides. "He dropped a lure, not sabotaged a treaty." "Do you truly believe that terrorizing a child will make him more competent or merely more terrified to make another error?" Alaric's face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes blazing. "You presume to tell me how to manage my staff, Lady Vance?" "I presume to speak for basic human decency," Elara shot back, her chest heaving. "He is a child, not a tool to be broken and discarded at your whim. If you expect loyalty and competence, you must first offer respect, even to the lowest servant." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken challenge. The hunting party watched, frozen, their breath held. Alaric's jaw was clenched so tight, Elara thought she might hear his teeth grind. His eyes, usually so controlled, sparked with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Anger, certainly, but something else, a flicker of surprise perhaps, or even a grudging respect. The air thrummed with a dangerous tension, a testament to the raw, unyielding wills of two individuals locked in an unexpected, heated exchange amidst the quiet splendor of the autumn woods. Whispers and unspoken chemistry. The scent of beeswax and old parchment clung to the Duke's study, a familiar fragrance that now seemed charged with an unspoken current whenever Elara was present. Their debates, once purely intellectual sparring, had morphed into something far more visceral. His eyes, keen and assessing, would linger on her for a fraction too long, a silent acknowledgement of the challenge she presented, and perhaps something else entirely. Elara, for her part, found herself acutely aware of the warmth emanating from him across the massive oak desk, the way his jaw would tighten when she pressed a point, the low rumble of his voice that resonated deep within her. The air between them often thrummed with a tension that had little to do with administrative policy and everything to do with a burgeoning, dangerous attraction. It was during a particularly heated discussion about grain quotas, with maps unfurled across the table and their heads bowed close together, that the fragile dam of polite distance finally broke. Elara, gesturing emphatically with a goblet of claret, misjudged her movement. The deep red liquid arced through the air, splashing across the pristine white cuff of Alaric's tunic, then spotting his waistcoat. A mortified gasp escaped her lips. "My apologies, Your Grace," she stammered, her cheeks flaming, a prickle of unease snaking up her spine. She snatched a linen napkin from the sideboard, dabbing clumsily at the dark stain. Alaric stilled her hand with a light touch that sent a jolt through her. His fingers, warm and firm, wrapped around her wrist. His gaze, usually so formidable, softened for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something akin to amusement dancing in their depths. "It's merely wine, Lady Elara," he murmured, his voice a low thrum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "No lasting damage done." Yet, his eyes, after a shared beat of intense silence, dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, holding her captive in a gaze that promised far more than mere forgiveness for a spilled drink. Lady Agatha, perched on a velvet fauteuil by the hearth, had watched the entire exchange with a visible tightening of her lips. Her usually placid expression was now edged with concern, her gaze flitting between Elara's flushed face and the Duke's unsettlingly tender demeanor. When Elara, still flustered, managed to extract her hand, she caught Agatha's warning look, a silent plea for propriety, a desperate signal to retreat, but a stubborn defiance, fueled by the Duke's lingering gaze, sparked within Elara. She met Agatha's stare with a barely perceptible tilt of her chin, a silent declaration that she would not be cowed. The incident, small as it was, became a catalyst. The court, a viper's nest of idle hands and sharper tongues, had already noted the undeniable shift in the dynamic between the Duke and his new advisor. Their arguments, once perceived as Alaric's attempts to break a spirited mare, were now viewed through a different lens. The way he would lean in, the way her voice would rise in impassioned defense, the charged silences that punctuated their debates, it all contributed to a growing narrative. Whispers began to snake through the gilded halls like tendrils of smoke. "Have you seen the way the Duke looks at her?" one lady would murmur to another, fanning herself delicately. "Quite improper, their closeness," another would add. "And her, so outspoken, hardly befitting a lady of her station." The spilled wine, accidental or not, was seized upon as further proof of Elara's forwardness, her lack of decorum. "She challenges him publicly," a baroness observed over afternoon tea, her voice laced with disdain. "It speaks volumes of her intentions, doesn't it? To diminish his authority so openly?" "Indeed," her companion agreed, dabbing at her mouth with a lace handkerchief. "And the way he permits it, it suggests a certain, shall we say, fondness that transcends professional respect. A dangerous path for a young woman of unestablished reputation." The word unestablished hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications of social ruin. Elara, though she tried to ignore the subtle shifts in conversation, the averted gazes, and the sudden lulls when she entered a room, felt the icy tendrils of rumor wrapping around her. The court, once merely indifferent, now watched her with a mixture of fascination and condemnation. Her quick wit, once lauded, was now deemed brazen. Her passionate advocacy, once admired, was now labeled as impertinence. The very qualities that had drawn Alaric's attention were now threatening to unravel her. Yet, despite the growing unease, she found herself unable to extinguish the spark that ignited whenever his eyes met hers, a spark that promised both peril and an exhilarating, forbidden connection. The whispers were growing louder, threatening to consume her, but the unspoken chemistry between her and the Duke was, if anything, growing stronger. Sanctuary in the library. The mortification of the spilled wine had barely faded when a summons arrived, not from Lady Agatha, as Elara might have expected, but from the Duke himself. Her stomach fluttered with a nervous anticipation she couldn't quite quell. The message, delivered by a solemn-faced page, was brief. "His Grace requests your presence in his private library this evening." The Duke's private library was a sanctuary whispered about in hushed tones, a place rarely, if ever, frequented by anyone outside his closest advisors, and certainly not by unmarried ladies. A prickle of unease ran down Alara's spine, mingling with a flicker of defiance. Was this a punishment? A subtle, humiliating reminder of her recent clumsiness? Or something else entirely? When she arrived, the heavy oak door swung inward silently, revealing a cavernous space where the scent of aged paper and beeswax hung thick in the air. Towering shelves, laden with leather-bound volumes, reached to a vaulted ceiling, their spines a kaleidoscope of forgotten knowledge. A fire crackled softly in a massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rich tapestries adorning the walls. Duke Alaric stood by a large globe, his finger tracing a line across its surface. He looked up, his gaze intense, devoid of the amused glint she'd seen at the feast. "Lady Alara," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble that resonated in the quiet room. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to a plush armchair opposite his own, nestled beside a heavy mahogany table strewn with maps and ancient scrolls. Alara settled into the velvet, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and exhilaration. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. He regarded her for a moment, a subtle curve to his lips. "I confess, Lady Alara, your spirited defense of the stable hands intrigued me." He picked up a leather-bound volume from the table, its cover embossed with a faded crest. "Few in my court possess such conviction." "Conviction, Your Grace, or perhaps merely a common appreciation for fairness," she countered, a spark igniting within her. Alaric's brow lifted. Fairness, an admirable quality certainly, but often, in the practicalities of governance, an inconvenient one. He opened the book, revealing intricate diagrams and ancient script. "Do you find solace in these pages, Lady Alara?" "Knowledge, Your Grace, offers its own form of solace," she replied, her eyes drawn to the illuminated text. "It offers understanding, and with understanding, perhaps a path to more convenient fairness." He chuckled, a low resonant sound that warmed the vast room. "Indeed, tell me then, what paths do you envision?" And so the evening unfolded. They spoke of ancient histories, of philosophical treatises on governance and the rights of subjects, of the intricacies of trade routes and the shifting alliances of distant kingdoms. Alara, finding herself in her element, spoke with an uninhibited passion that surprised even herself. She challenged his interpretations, presented alternative viewpoints, and articulated her own beliefs with a clarity that seemed to captivate him. Alaric, in turn, listened with an attentiveness that was both unnerving and deeply flattering. He probed her reasoning, not with dismissal, but with a genuine desire to understand. He revealed a breadth of knowledge that far surpassed the courtly superficialities, a mind that delved into the deep currents of history and human nature. He spoke of the heavy weight of leadership, the difficult choices, the compromises that often bruised the soul. As the hours passed, the initial tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a shared intellectual fervor. The world outside, with its whispers and expectations, faded into irrelevance. Here, amidst the quiet majesty of the library, Alara felt truly seen, truly heard, in a way she hadn't experienced before. She saw beyond the Duke's formidable reputation, glimpsing the formidable mind beneath, a mind that wrestled with the same profound questions that occupied her own. When Alaric finally closed the book he'd been holding, the fire had dwindled to embers, and the moon cast long, silvery streaks through the tall windows. "It grows late, Lady Alara," he said, his voice softer now. "But this has been enlightening." He met her gaze, and in his eyes, Alara saw not just respect, but something deeper. A nascent understanding that transcended words. "I invite you to return whenever you wish. These doors are open to you." The invitation, so casually given, felt like a profound privilege, a silent acknowledgement of a connection forged not in courtly dances or social niceties, but in the shared pursuit of truth. As she left the library, the scent of old paper clinging to her gown, Alara carried not just the weight of the Duke's words, but a growing certainty that her path in this court, once so uncertain, was about to take an unforeseen and perhaps perilous turn. A storm, a secret, a shared moment. The heavens wept, a furious deluge drumming against the leaded panes of the library's tall windows. Rain lashed down in sheets, blurring the ancient oaks outside into indistinct, writhing shadows. Inside, a different kind of storm brewed, though its origins were far more terrestrial. Elara stood frozen, a crimson stain blooming on the front of Alaric's meticulously tailored doublet, an unfortunate consequence of her startled flinch when a particularly violent crack of thunder had rattled the very foundations of the castle. The goblet, now empty, lay at her feet like a shattered promise. "My apologies, Your Grace," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper over the din of the tempest. Her cheeks burned, not just from embarrassment, but from a prickle of unease. Such an egregious error in his personal sanctuary could easily be misconstrued, or worse, punished. Alaric, however, merely raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping from the wine-drenched fabric to her mortified expression. "It seems the elements have conspired to maroon us, Lady Elara," he observed, his tone surprisingly devoid of the expected reprimand, "and to christen my new silk with a vintage that, I must admit, is rather exquisite." A flicker of something akin to amusement touched his lips. A fresh peal of thunder reverberated, shaking the floorboards. The flickering fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows that elongated their figures, making them seem isolated, almost vulnerable in the vast room. The servants, having retired before the storm truly broke, were now inaccessible, the castle a fortress against the onslaught of nature. "Perhaps you should change, Your Grace," Alara suggested, finding a sliver of defiance to push past her mortification. "You'll catch a chill." He merely shrugged, a casual gesture that belied his usual rigid formality. "A little wine and water won't be the death of me, Lady Alara. Come, the fire draws near. We may as well make ourselves comfortable since the outside world has decided to cease its spinning." He gestured to two ornate, high-backed chairs facing the hearth, their plush velvet inviting in the chill air. Reluctantly, Alara obeyed, settling into one chair while Alaric took the other, the red stain on his chest a silent testament to her clumsiness. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the roaring wind and the rhythmic drumming of rain. It was a silence unlike any they'd shared before, not the charged quiet of intellectual debate, but something softer, more intimate. "Do you ever find yourself wishing for a moment's respite from it all?" Alaric asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, not on her. His voice was lower, rougher than usual, as if the storm had stripped away some of its customary polish. Alara hesitated. From what, Your Grace? He finally turned his head. His eyes, usually so sharp and assessing, held a distant, almost wistful quality. From the ceaseless expectation, the weight of a name, the endless procession of demands, judgments, and alliances. He paused, a shadow passing over his features. Sometimes, I yearn for the simplicity of a forgotten path, a life unburdened by titles and duty. The confession hung in the air, startling in its frankness. Alara, who had always seen him as an unyielding pillar of authority, was momentarily stunned. She pictured him, not as the feared duke, but as a boy, perhaps, dreaming of escaping the confines of his birthright. I understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Though my burdens are of a different scale, the desire for anonymity, for a moment to simply be, without expectation, it's a powerful siren's call. She thought of her own predicament, the whispers, the watchful eyes of society, the constant pressure to conform. Sometimes I wish I could shed the skin of Lady Alara Vance and simply be Alara. A faint smile touched his lips, a genuine, unburdened curve that transformed his stern features. Alara, he repeated, the name sounding foreign, yet oddly familiar on his tongue. It suits you, direct, unadorned. He shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, the firelight catching the glint in his eyes. Tell me, Alara, what would you do if you were simply Alara, unencumbered? The question was a key, unlocking a part of her she rarely exposed. I would travel, she confessed, a spark igniting in her own eyes, to distant lands, to see mountains that touch the sky and seas that stretch beyond the horizon. I would read every book, learn every language, and speak to every soul I encountered, without fear of impropriety or judgment. She leaned forward too, the shared secret making the space between them shrink. And I would help people, not with the sterile dictates of court, but with genuine compassion, one person at a time. He listened, truly listened, his gaze unwavering. For a fleeting moment, the Duke and the lady vanished, replaced by two souls sharing a secret fire against the backdrop of a raging storm. The shared vulnerability, the unexpected glimpse into their innermost selves, wove an invisible thread between them, tightening the nascent connection that had begun in his library, in the quiet exchange of ideas. The storm outside intensified, yet within the library a profound stillness settled, heavy with the weight of unspoken understanding. Lord Beaumont's scheme. The storm's afterglow lingered not in the firmament, but in the charged space between Alara and Alaric. Their whispered confession, punctuated by distant thunder, had left her feeling vulnerable, yet strangely alive. This fragile peace shattered with Lord Beaumont's morning entrance. He glided into the salon, an embodiment of practiced charm, his gaze raking over Alara with a possessive glint that turned her stomach. Lady Alara, he purred, a honeyed venom in his voice, you appear remarkably sprightly this morning. One might almost imagine you'd spent the night reveling, rather than poring over the Duke's arduous decrees. A ripple of murmurs spread through the assembled courtiers, their eyes flitting between Alara and Beaumont. Alara felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a prickle of unease. She recognized Beaumont's tactic, subtle slights, designed to chip away at her composure. And you, Lord Beaumont, Alara countered, a spark of defiance in her eyes, seem to have discovered a newfound appreciation for the mundane. I confess, I find discussing the Duke's mandates far more stimulating than dissecting the latest whispers. Beaumont's smile thinned, his knuckles whitening on the silver pommel of his cane. Ah, but some whispers are rather pointed, wouldn't you agree? Like those concerning a certain lady's rather exuberant interaction with the Duke's personal effects last night. A spill, I believe. He let the word hang, heavy with innuendo. Ilara's cheeks flamed. The memory of the wine, the sudden intimacy, Alaric's intense gaze, it all rushed back, magnified by Beaumont's malicious leer. She could feel the judging stares of the other courtiers. Lady Agatha, ever observant, subtly wrung her hands, her eyes silently pleading with Ilara to de-escalate. Before Ilara could formulate a cutting retort, a voice, calm yet edged with steel, sliced through the tension. Lord Beaumont, Duke Alaric said, his tone barely above a whisper, yet it commanded silence like a clap of thunder. He had entered the salon unnoticed, his presence now a palpable weight. I was under the impression that the affairs of my household, particularly those concerning my personal garments, were not subjects for public discourse. Beaumont's carefully constructed facade faltered. He bowed, a fraction too quickly. My apologies, Your Grace. Merely an observation, a light-hearted jest. Light-hearted jests, Alaric continued, his eyes, like flint, locking onto Beaumont, tend to be humorous. I confess, I find nothing amusing about a lady being subjected to veiled accusations simply for an accidental mishap. Accidents, after all, happen to us all, even to those who believe themselves immune to imperfection. The last phrase was delivered with a pointed intensity that left no doubt as to its target. A shiver ran through the room. Alaric's defense was subtle, yet undeniably firm. He hadn't roared or threatened, but his quiet warning was far more chilling. It was a clear delineation. Ilara, for all her disruptive nature, was under his protection. Beaumont's face, usually so composed, became a mask of barely concealed fury. He offered another stiff bow, all grace absent this time. Of course, Your Grace, my error. I shall endeavour to be more discerning in my observations. His gaze, however, flickered back to Ilara, a promise of future retribution burning in their depths. Ilara felt a strange blend of relief and bewildered surprise. The Duke had defended her, not with grand pronouncements, but with a quiet, authoritative assertion that silenced Beaumont and shifted the narrative. It was a small act, but in the intricate dance of court politics, it spoke volumes. It revealed a protective streak she hadn't fully anticipated, a crack in the Duke's formidable armour. As Alaric turned to address a courtier about trade routes, effectively dismissing Beaumont, the defeated lord retreated to the edge of the salon, his eyes narrowed on Ilara. His scheme had backfired. Instead of humiliating her, he had inadvertently highlighted her growing proximity to the Duke and the Duke's unexpected favour. A bitter taste filled his mouth. This was not the end. He would find another way to bring Lady Ilara Vance to heel, a way that even the Duke's subtle protection could not circumvent. He would watch, he would wait, and he would strike when she was most vulnerable. The scandalous letter. The rustle of parchment filled the air, not with the gentle whisper of a love note, but with the sharp crackle of wildfire. It began subtly, a hushed exchange between two dowagers in a shadowed alcove at the Fitzwilliam soiree. Then a knowing glance passed between a pair of young gentlemen by the punch bowl. By morning, The scandalous letter was no longer a secret. It was a contagion, sweeping through the drawing rooms and card tables of the ton with ruthless efficiency. Elara first heard of it from a tearful Lady Agatha who arrived at her doorstep, clutching a crumpled missive as if it were a venomous snake. "Elara, my dear, you must see this," Agatha choked out, her face pale, eyes wide with horror. "It's everywhere. They say, they say it's from you." Elara took the paper. The script, though undeniably elegant, was not her own, yet the words carved themselves into her mind with chilling precision. It spoke of stolen glances, of clandestine meetings under the cloak of twilight, of a burning passion for an unnamed admirer, penned with an audacious intimacy that made Elara's stomach churn. The closing line, however, was the most damning. "Yours, utterly and irrevocably, E.V." Her blood ran cold. The letter was a masterpiece of calculated ruin, designed to paint her as a woman of loose morals, driven by illicit desires. It had been discovered, so the whispers claimed, tucked into a forgotten book in the library at Lord Harrington's estate, a location where Elara had indeed been present just 2 days prior. The sheer audacity of the fabrication was staggering. Within hours, the polite smiles of society had congealed into icy stares. Invitations, once plentiful, ceased to arrive. The morning calls from her few remaining friends were met with averted gazes and hurried excuses. At the afternoon promenade, a path cleared around her as if she carried the plague. Whispers followed her like a shadow, each one a sharp blade. "Did you hear about Lady Elara? Such a brazen display, and to think she seemed so innocent." The weight of their judgment pressed down on her, suffocating. Shame, hot and consuming, flushed her cheeks, even as a fierce anger flickered within. She knew, with a certainty that resonated to her bones, who stood behind this venomous assault. Lord Beaumont. This was his retribution, swift and devastating, for the humiliation he had endured at the Duke's hands. He hadn't just sought to discredit her, he aimed for total annihilation. Elara retreated to her rooms, the silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of accusations outside. She paced, a knot of dread tightening in her chest. Social ruin was not merely a matter of bruised pride. For a woman of her standing, without significant family fortune or a protective male figure, it meant a life of isolation, destitution, and utter disgrace. She would be an outcast, forever branded. The fear was a cold, creeping tendril wrapping around her heart. How could she possibly defend herself against such a meticulously crafted lie, especially when the very society that condemned her was so eager to believe the worst? Every detail, from the forged handwriting to the cleverly chosen discovery location, screamed of a mastermind at work. A knock at her door startled her. It was her maid, looking unusually grave. "My lady," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, "a message has arrived. From the Duke." Elara's heart gave a strange leap. Alaric, the one man who had, against all odds, offered her a semblance of protection. But what could even he do against the relentless tide of public opinion? The letter felt like a final, insurmountable barrier, placed strategically to cut her off from any potential allies, and perhaps even from him. The scandal threatened to consume her whole, leaving no trace of the woman she was trying to become. Society's condemnation and Alaric's confrontation. The cloying silence that greeted Elara upon her arrival at Lady Ashworth's charitable luncheon was more deafening than any shouted accusation. Where once a flurry of greetings, a rustle of silk, and the tinkling of laughter would have enveloped her. Now only averted gazes and hushed whispers followed her path. The air in the opulent drawing room, usually perfumed with rose and lavender, now carried the acrid scent of judgment. Lady Ashworth herself, a woman usually effusive in her welcome, offered a stiff nod, her smile as thin and brittle as old lace. Elara felt eyes on her, sharp as daggers, dissecting her every movement. She was a pariah, an untouchable, her reputation shredded by the venomous ink of a forged letter. The very thought made her stomach churn, a sickening blend of anger and despair. When Lady Agatha, pale and trembling, approached her later, clutching a crumpled handkerchief, Elara's heart sank further. "Elara," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. I know it's not true, but everyone is saying, it's horrid." Agatha, bless her innocent heart, still harbored a shred of belief in Elara's integrity, a stark contrast to the glacial stares of the other ladies who now pointedly turned their backs. The isolation was absolute, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. Each calculated snub, each muttered insult, was a brick in the wall being built around her, designed to trap her in a cage of disgrace. Returning to her modest lodgings, the weight of societal condemnation pressed down on her, the familiar comfort of her rooms offering little solace. The Duke's messenger had arrived moments after she'd stepped inside, a terse note summoning her to his study. Elara's hands trembled as she dressed, a cold knot forming in her stomach. This was it, the reckoning. She fully expected a dismissal, a polite but firm severance of ties, perhaps even a thinly veiled reprimand. What else could he do? His position, his reputation, his very power demanded he distance himself from scandal. The Duke's study, usually a sanctuary of weighty tomes and the scent of aged leather, felt different tonight. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the shadows cast by the flickering fire seeming to lengthen and twist into ominous shapes. Alaric stood before the grand fireplace, his back to her, his posture rigid. The familiar scent of bergamot and ink, usually a comfort, now felt like a prelude to her doom. He turned slowly, his face a mask of impenetrable calm. His eyes, usually so expressive, were unreadable, like polished obsidian. "Lady Elara," he began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth, a flat pronouncement that sent a shiver down her spine. He held up a piece of parchment, its elegant script instantly recognizable as the very letter that had destroyed her life. "This has been circulating. It bears your purported signature." Elara's breath hitched. She wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice, to tear the vile fabrication from his hand. Instead, she met his gaze, her own chin lifting in a flicker of defiance, despite the fear coiling in her gut. "It is a forgery, Your Grace, a malicious fabrication." Alaric's gaze intensified, boring into her, searching for any tell, any flicker of guilt. "Are you quite certain?" His voice was low, dangerous. The ambiguity in his tone, the stark question, was a betrayal in itself. He wasn't dismissing it outright. He was considering the possibility. He was weighing her word against the insidious whisperings of the court. The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through her. Had she misjudged him entirely? Was this brilliant, complex man, the one who had seen beyond her status and appreciated her intellect, about to abandon her to the wolves? The terror of his ultimate rejection, of being truly alone in this hostile world, was a cold, sharp blade to her heart. She stood her ground, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am," with every fiber of my being, your grace. His silence stretched, a vast echoing chasm between them. The fire crackled, a lone noisy witness to her impending fate. Elara's mind raced, searching for any sign, any hint of his true intention. But Alaric's face remained a perfect, unyielding blank. The only sound was the frantic beat of her own heart, a drum roll to her inevitable downfall. A tearful confession. Elara's breath hitched, a ragged sound that tore from her chest. The incriminating letter lay between them, a silent wedge, and Alaric's gaze, unyielding and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed composure. The elegant salon, once a sanctuary of intellectual exchange, now felt like a gilded cage. I did not write this, she whispered again, her voice thin, barely audible above the frantic beat of her own heart. A tear, hot and stinging, traced a path down her cheek, leaving a cool track on her skin. She swiped at it impatiently, frustrated by her body's betrayal. Vulnerability was a luxury she could ill afford. Alaric remained motionless, his dark eyes like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing of his inner thoughts. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, amplifying the frantic thrum of Elara's pulse in her ears. She felt a desperate need to shatter it, to make him understand, to claw her way back from the precipice of his judgment. "It's a lie," she burst out, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. "A cruel, malicious fabrication designed to separate us." The words hung in the air, raw and exposed. She watched, mesmerized, as a flicker, a mere ripple, crossed Alaric's impassive features. Was it surprise? Doubt? She couldn't tell. "Separate us, Elara?" His voice, when it came, was low, almost a murmur, yet it vibrated with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. And why would someone wish to do that? The question hung heavy, loaded with implications. Elara's gaze dropped to the letter, then lifted to meet his once more. Her eyes, swimming with unshed tears, pleaded with him. Because they see what I see, what I feel." Her voice trembled, the confession tearing at her throat. "Alaric, I care for you, more than I have ever cared for anyone, more than I ever thought possible." The admission, spoken aloud, felt like a dam breaking within her. The carefully guarded walls around her heart crumbled, exposing the raw, aching truth. Tears streamed freely now, blurring her vision, but she refused to look away. She needed him to see the truth in her eyes, in her raw vulnerability. "I know it's scandalous," she continued, her voice catching on a sob. "I know it defies every expectation, but I cannot deny it. You challenge me, you infuriate me, and you make me feel alive in a way no one else ever has. This letter," she gestured wildly at the parchment, "is a desperate attempt to sever that connection, to ruin me in your eyes because they perceive our bond as a threat." She took a shaky breath, struggling to compose herself. "I have no proof beyond my word, beyond the sincerity of my feelings, but I swear to you, on everything I hold dear, that I did not write those words. They are a poison crafted to turn you against me." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. "Please, Alaric, you must believe me." The salon was utterly silent, save for Elara's ragged breathing and the soft rustle of her gown as she shifted, her entire being focused on his reaction. Every muscle in Alaric's formidable frame remained rigid. His dark eyes, which had held a flicker of something unreadable, now seemed to deepen, drawing her in. He reached out a hand, slowly, deliberately, not towards her, but towards the letter. His fingers brushed the heavy parchment, his gaze still fixed on hers. He said nothing, but the intensity of his silence was more potent than any accusation. Elara felt a fresh wave of despair threaten to engulf her. Had she miscalculated? Had her desperate, tearful confession only served to confirm her perceived instability? The weight of his unspoken judgment was a physical burden, pressing down on her, threatening to crush her hope. The scent of old books and faint wood smoke, usually comforting, now seemed to mock her, a reminder of the intellectual sanctuary she might be about to lose forever. Her fate, she realized with chilling clarity, lay entirely in his hands. And for the first time in her life, Elara Vance felt utterly, terrifyingly helpless. The royal ball, a public revelation. The grand ballroom of the royal palace shimmered with 1,000 candles, their light catching on cascades of silk, the glitter of jewels, and the polished surfaces of dancing shoes. A string orchestra wove a tapestry of sound, both opulent and subtly tense. Tonight, the annual royal ball was a spectacle designed to impress, but beneath the surface, a frisson of anticipation, thick as the perfumed air, had settled. All eyes, it seemed, occasionally drifted towards Elara, who stood near the periphery, a figure of quiet defiance in a gown the color of twilight. The whispers, though muffled by music and conversation, were still audible, like the rustle of dry leaves in an otherwise still garden. Lord Beaumont, a smirk playing on his lips, had already made a point of not meeting her gaze, instead engaging in animated conversation with a gaggle of ladies, their laughter sharp and brittle. Elara felt a prickle of unease, a cold premonition, despite Lady Agatha's comforting presence beside her. Agatha, pale and anxious, occasionally squeezed Elara's arm, a silent testament to their shared strain. "Hold your head high, Elara," Agatha murmured, her voice barely a breath. "They will not break you." The Duke, a dark commanding presence, was at the heart of the room, conversing with the king. His presence was a gravitational pull, drawing glances and hushed reverence. Elara found her own gaze drawn to him, a dangerous habit. Just then, a careless attendant bumped into her, sending a splash of crimson wine arcing towards Alaric's pristine white cravat. A collective gasp rippled through the nearest onlookers. Elara's heart hammered. "My apologies, Your Grace," she managed, reaching instinctively with a napkin, a foolish, impulsive gesture that only drew more attention. Alaric merely raised a dark eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over her, unreadable. The moment stretched, taut as a violin string, before he gave an almost imperceptible nod, dismissing the incident. But the damage, Elara knew, was done. Another slip, another mark against her. Suddenly, a profound silence descended, the orchestra fading into a hushed murmur. The king had moved to the central dais, Duke Alaric a step behind him. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. This was not a customary address. The king cleared his throat. "My esteemed guests, a matter of some import has come to our attention. A malicious fabrication, a letter of rather scandalous content, has circulated amongst certain circles, impugning the character of Lady Elara Vance." A wave of murmurs, louder and more agitated this time, erupted, quickly silenced by a stern look from the king. Alaric stepped forward, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers, clear and resonant, filling the vast hall. Indeed, forged evidence, designed to ruin a lady's reputation, is a grave offense against the crown and against decency itself. His gaze swept across the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on Lord Beaumont, who noticeably stiffened. "The true author of this despicable missive," Alaric continued, his voice now imbued with a chilling calm, "is not Lady Alara Vance. It is, in fact, Lord Beaumont." A gasp, like the sound of 1,000 silken dresses rustling at once, tore through the ballroom. All eyes, which had been fixed on the dais, now swung to Lord Beaumont. His face, usually a mask of casual arrogance, drained of color, leaving a stark, mottled pallor. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and terror. "We have obtained irrefutable proof," Alaric stated, a parchment appearing in his hand as if by magic. "A confession, signed and witnessed, outlining his scheme for retribution against Lady Alara, whom he perceived as having slighted him." The confession, Alaric explained, detailed Beaumont's meticulous plan to replicate Alara's handwriting, even using a specific brand of ink known to be favored by her, all to frame her. He had sought to punish her for a perceived social slight, believing her too inconsequential to fight back. Alara felt a dizzying surge of relief, so potent it threatened to buckle her knees. Vindicated. The word echoed in her mind, a sweet, clear bell. The weight that had pressed upon her, a suffocating shroud of shame and accusation, lifted, leaving her light-headed. Lady Agatha, tears welling in her eyes, embraced her tightly. The Duke's announcement had not merely cleared her name. It had publicly shamed her accuser, turning the tables with a breathtaking swiftness. The ballroom, moments ago a crucible of judgment, was now a tableau of stunned silence, punctuated only by the occasional sharp intake of breath. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, one born of shock and the sudden, dramatic shift of power. Lord Beaumont, ostracized and exposed, stood utterly alone, a pariah in a room full of eyes that now regarded him with scorn. Alara met Alaric's gaze across the expanse of the ballroom. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a subtle glint in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, a silent acknowledgement that transcended the clamour and the scandal. The game, she realized, had just changed. A choice for love. The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was a physical wave, leaving Alaric and Alara at its epicenter. Beaumont, a picture of aristocratic ruin, was being led away by two solemn guards, his face a mask of purple fury and desperate pleas that went unheard. The king's pronouncement had shattered the carefully constructed facade of the court, exposing its cruel underbelly and, in doing so, elevating Alara from pariah to an unlikely heroine. Yet, the air still crackled with residual tension, a hushed anticipation of what would come next. Alara, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, felt a strange mix of vindication and apprehension. The weight of every scornful glance, every whispered slight had been lifted, replaced by a dizzying sense of relief. But then Alaric turned, his gaze intense, unwavering, and suddenly the enormity of the moment settled upon her. He wasn't just looking at her, he was looking through her, seeing something she hadn't dared to articulate, even to herself. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her, then another, the space between them shrinking with each measured movement. The king, a subtle smile playing on his lips, gave a slight nod, a silent blessing that went unnoticed by most, but not by Alara. The entire assembly seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on the Duke and the woman who had, against all odds, captured his formidable attention. When Alaric finally stood before her, the air thrummed with unspoken words. He didn't offer a platitude, nor did he make a grand gesture. Instead, his voice, though low, carried through the stunned silence, resonating with an authority that commanded absolute attention. "Lady Alara Vance," he began, his eyes never leaving hers, "you have, with admirable courage and an unwavering spirit, navigated the treacherous currents of this court. You have faced calumny and deceit with a strength that belies your delicate frame." Alara felt a flush creep up her neck, a strange blend of embarrassment and a powerful, exhilarating pride. His words, publicly spoken, were a balm to her battered spirit. Lady Agatha, standing a few feet away, pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. Alaric paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles, lingering for a moment on those who had been most vocal in their condemnation of Alara. A flicker of something akin to defiance passed through his eyes, a silent challenge to their ingrained prejudices. Then he turned back to Alara, his expression softening, revealing a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed. "For too long," he continued, his voice now imbued with a deeper timbre, "I have allowed the dictates of power and the expectations of society to guide my path. I have sought a match that would strengthen my position, secure my lineage, and conform to the rigid structures of our world." His words hung in the air, a stark admission that silenced even the most persistent whispers. "But in you, Alara," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that still managed to electrify the room, "I have found something far more profound than mere advantage. I have found an intellect that challenges me, a spirit that ignites mine, and a heart that, despite all adversity, remains true." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, a stunned disbelief that quickly morphed into a flurry of hushed speculation. Duchess Eleanor, her face a mask of shock, clutched her husband's arm. Alaric reached out, his hand gently taking hers. His touch was warm, firm, and surprisingly tender. "Lady Alara Vance," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, "I ask you to be my wife. I offer you not just my name, my title, and my lands, but my unwavering loyalty, my respect, and my heart. I choose you, Alara, above all others, and I choose a future shaped by our unconventional love, not by the stifling expectations of this court." The silence that followed was absolute, a palpable void broken only by the frantic beat of Elara's own heart. Her breath hitched in her throat. The Duke, the feared Alaric, was proposing marriage, not in the quiet confines of a private chamber, but before the entire royal court. It was a declaration of war against societal norms, a shattering of every aristocratic expectation. Tears, hot and unexpected, pricked at Elara's eyes. This was not the polite, politically expedient proposal she might have anticipated. This was raw, audacious, and utterly wonderfully Alaric. He wasn't just asking for her hand. He was laying bare his soul, risking everything for a connection that defied logic and tradition. She looked into his eyes, seeing not just the formidable Duke, but the man who had seen her, truly seen her, amidst the shadows of courtly intrigue. And in that moment, a profound certainty settled within her. This was her choice too. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet resounding with the full weight of her conviction. Yes, Alaric. A collective exhalation swept through the ballroom. The king himself gave a robust clap, a signal for the muted applause that followed. It was not a thunderous ovation, but a tentative, stunned acknowledgement of a truly unprecedented event. Society, rigid and unyielding, had just witnessed its most powerful member shatter its most sacred conventions. And in the center of it all, Alaric and Elara, their hands clasped, sealed their unconventional romance, a testament to a love that had defied ruin and triumphed against the very fabric of their world.